I sure
Excellent.
can. And you can hear me, obviously.
I can. Thank you so much for coming out and chatting with me today, Charlie. I know you're a really busy guy, so I really appreciate this time that you're spending with me today.
I'm glad to do it.
All right. So today you are going to enlighten us about the economic situation and a little bit about our role as IGCs in the supply chain and how important it is to
Right.
ensure that we establish and keep those relationships going with our vendors.
Right.
Let's just dive right in. I don't want to take up a lot of your time, so let's get to those juicy nuggets that you're going to share with us today.
Well, it's unprecedented times. We have basically accomplished what took the Great Recession 18 months to do on about 3 to 4 weeks. And so we're at 22 million people unemployed across the country. And that's a conservative estimate. That's only the folks that we know of. There is a quote unquote virtual unemployment line that is out there of folks that have been filing for unemployment, but they've not been able to successfully get unemployment. So we don't know exactly how many folks there are that are in that current situation. So because of that, we saw retail sales go down 8.7% in March. Now, mind you, it was only the last 2.5 weeks of March that really the wheels came off the cart.
Mhm.
So we saw just a tremendous decrease in the amount of goods and services that people were purchasing to the tune of 8.7%. That we've never seen a drop like that in that sort of time period since I think during World War II.
Wow.
I mean, it was unprecedented. That's not even the extent of it. We haven't even seen the April data yet, so that's going to even be a little more scarier. Now, even though that's occurring, I mean, obviously, you had some folks that were stocking up, hoarding, if you will, on toilet paper and other items, and so there was a lot of retail sales at the very beginning, but that's gradually declined. So that's for goods and services in total. However, for the green industry, it's been mixed, and it's been very mixed depending on what part of the country that you're in right now. So obviously, if you're in Michigan or Pennsylvania, Vermont, things don't look so well from a lawn and garden standpoint because those garden centers and landscapers were deemed not to be essential, was really chaps my hide in terms of not being deemed essential. Finally, we got the Department of Homeland Security just over the weekend. They changed their guidelines to the states, and it did say that growers of plants and distributors of plant related products are now deemed essential.
Mhm.
Now, will that make a difference to some of the governors that have shut garden centers down? That's a good question. I don't know exactly the answer to that. Now, some of the other economic dimensions we've seen, obviously disruptions in the supply chain. Those garden centers that are out there that have florist divisions recognize the fact that the whole cut flower floral supply chain was basically in upheaval because we were limiting exports and there weren't that many supermarkets putting out flowers, and that's what drives a lot of the international demand and the amount of air freight that was being delivered was cut at least by half. I mean, airlines, maybe even more than that. And then, of course, trucking has been a challenge in terms of getting enough trucks to go from manufacturer to distributor to the garden center. So there's been all kinds of obstacles economically. And of course, housing fell by 22% as well. And we're directly correlated with housing.
Yeah.
Now, that's the not so good news, right? Now, tell me some good news, Charlie.
This is the
Well,
reality, though. It's amazing. Like it's a
it
web.
is,
Everything is
and
connected.
yeah, and Shelley, I wish I knew what the shape of the recovery was going to be. We'd like for it to be this nice V shape where we have the decline. And then when we open things back up and we get back to work, which over the weekend, the federal government also released guidelines for getting back to work.
Mhm.
So there's some states, particularly red states, that are making noises about opening up.
Yeah,
And again, this coronavirus has affected different parts of the country in different ways. And so it's not affected everybody equally. So some of the states that have been the least hit right now and that have not peaked in terms of their curve, those are the ones that we're talking about opening up. Now, from an economics point of view, there's no way we should be doing that right now
right.
because even the guidelines from the federal government say that you need to have the testing in place. There needs to be 14 days of consecutive declines in the number of cases. The hospitals need enough equipment and personnel to be able to handle any sort of second wave.
Mhm.
And particularly in the states that the president tweeted a few days ago, liberate such and such state, liberate such and it's precisely those states in which those circumstances aren't true.
Mhm.
They don't have enough testing going on. They don't have 14 days of consecutive declining cases, and they don't have the hospital bandwidth to treat. And yet, there's this dichotomy from our administration that they say one thing, but then turn around and do not necessarily the opposite, but they're not fulfilling what they should be fulfilling.
Mhm.
But we need testing, right? We need test and trace, test and trace, test and trace. That's the key to opening up and opening up wisely. Because if we don't, Shelley, then the subsequent economic impacts are going to be even worse.
Mhm.
If we open up and we don't do it right,
Mhm.
then it's going to have an even more detrimental economic impact than what we're seeing right now.
Well,
So
it's going to
where do
be one of
gardens?
those things
Okay, go
that,
ahead.
sorry, it's just, I mean, I can't imagine that it took a lot of effort to slow everything down to like a stop.
Right.
And then to get that wheel turning again is a massive effort. So much expense, so much labor just to get that going back the other thing, get the trucks going and everything back again to have it get slammed again with a second wave, like you say. So I agree with you on that. I think that how does that look in the long term? Like that could be really devastating to
Yeah.
try to do it again.
And we know there will be a second wave.
Yeah,
In every epidemic, there's always a second wave and sometimes a third wave.
yeah.
So will we be prepared for that second wave? And yeah, I mentioned about the V-shaped recovery. So the likelihood of that occurring, us bouncing right back, is negligible.
Mhm.
So the question then is, are we going to have how much of a U-shaped recovery? How much of this bottom are we going to experience, and then come out of that? And is it going to be like the Great Recession, where it's a hockey stick, where we go down and then we gradually increase over time, and it looks like a hockey stick in terms of that curve? I don't know right now. So we're putting in relief packages. I say we, the Treasury and the Federal Reserve, and of course the Congress. They're all making these concessions in terms of supporting businesses. And for garden centers out there, many of those have petitioned for uh, payroll protection loans and through SBA, but that money ran out on the 13th. And so Congress is debating right now relief package number 4 to put another 350 million into the PPP program, and so that those that have been approved and are awaiting money, but there's no money, that those loans would actually be fulfilled,
Mhm.
right? So that's a stopgap. Now, what happens if you're for 8 weeks? We manage this thing, and then there's the 12, 16 weeks in, there's a second wave because we opened up too fast. Are we going to go back and add another 2 trillion to the debt? And that's where we stand, right? And so right now, I've always been very conservative in terms of adding to the national debt because the interest on that debt keeps becoming a larger and larger part of our national budget every year. And it's going to get to the point where the number one item that we have to pay with our taxes is the interest on our former debt. Well, that's never a good thing, because you'd like for your taxes to go to somewhere besides just paying interest. Just like when you buy a car and you got a car loan, when you make a payment, you'd like for that payment to bring the principal down, not necessarily go all towards interest. Well, that's the situation we'll find ourselves in as far as a country, unless we curb this. But this is not the time to really worry about that, because if we don't survive until then, it's all for naught anyway.
Exactly.
So we're trying to survive. And garden centers, even in the areas where they are deemed to be essential, they're trying to survive. They're offering curbside pickup, delivery. They're certainly ramping up e-commerce applications and so forth. However, even the best of those, even those who were offering those services already, and so they were just accelerating the movement of those services or offering those services, you can't get the same transaction count from doing just those than you can when you have in-person sales, when you bring in everybody, the masses. So what's left? Well, you got to sell more to the people that you're selling to right now. So if it's a third fewer transaction count, you got to sell them 3 times as much to stay level with sales. And so for right now, the good news is that when you look across the country in terms of the sales, year-to-date sales, many garden centers are above where they were last year right now. Mm-hmm. Right. So there's Danny Summers with the Garden Center Group is a good friend of mine. We trade information. Ian Baldwin has a 5 numbers project. It's very similar to my your market metrics benchmarking that I do for growers. And both of those guys share information with me. And so what I'm hearing from them is that though transaction counts are down, year-to-date sales have been up. That's because January and February and early March sales were above where they were this time last year. That's the frustrating thing, Shelley, is we were poised for a magnificent year. This was going to be the year that we could earn exactly what we're worth. And now, that's been pulled, that whatever's been pulled out, the rug's been pulled out from under us in that regard. So there's, in most parts of the country, again, garden centers are ahead year to date, those that have remained open. But there's also, I forget the exact numbers of those that are closed. If you look at the Garden Center Group and then the 5 numbers, the garden centers that are in the 5 numbers project, that's about 200 garden centers represented in those 2 groups, roughly. About 50 to 57%, depending on which group you're talking about, are 100% open. So half the garden centers out there are 100% open. And there's, in one group, there's 50%, in one group, there's 35% that are at least partially open. So that's good news. If you look at the bulk of the garden centers out there, they're at least partially open or full open. And then there's a remaining 10% or so that are closed entirely. And of course, I'm not getting into the debate as to whether they should be open. There are those that could contend that they shouldn't be open. They should be participating in the sheltering at home and minimizing any risk of spreading this thing, which has cost us nearly 43,000 lives now.
Yeah.
More so than any other cause of death this year, the coronavirus, because you hear this rhetoric in the news about, well, the common flu causes this many deaths and car wrecks and drugs and so forth. This year, you got to compare apples to apples. Yeah. In the same time period, it's killed more people than anything else. That's for sure. Yeah. So there's just a lot of nuances of this issue. And those garden centers that survive this thing are going to be those that have heard me and others. You got some great consultants in this industry the garden center industry, and I spend less of my time talking to garden centers than other sectors. However, those that I've been talking to, when they ask me what contingencies they should do to prepare for recessions, I've always said these things. First of all, make sure that you're not over leveraged and that the bank doesn't have more skin in the game than you do. Secondly, I said that you need to have your working capital, that is your cash flow, managed so that you can ride out downturns.
Yeah.
And then thirdly, you need to be as lean and as efficient as possible. And you don't overstaff and you don't over inventory. So you be lean in both those regards. And then lastly, you make darn sure that your value proposition is such that your customer base deems you to be essential. And I actually use those words for the last few years, that they deem you to be essential, that you're a necessity in their lives and not a mere luxury that they can cast aside. And so here's the cool part, is that we can do that if we emphasize the functional benefits of plants, the economic benefits they provide, that is the ROI on our houses and the reduced heating and cooling costs, and the increased ecosystem services that they provide. And then last, but certainly not least, the health and well-being benefits. And that's where my platform, any speech that I've given over the last decade, I've talked about the benefits of plants. And that needs to be our value proposition for the future. And I wrote a seminal article back in 2011 that's on my website, ellisonchair.tamu.edu. And there's a benefits of plants section on that website. And you click on that, and the article number 1 talked about all the research on the benefits of plants until 2011. Well, I was updating that last year with a graduate student, and she and I were pulling together all the resources on the economics, environmental, and health and well-being benefits. And so we started with the health and well-being benefits, and I started writing this article. Well, I couldn't fit it into one article. I had to write a 4-part series on the health and well-being benefits that plants provide. Yeah. Everybody that lives in the midst, lives, works, plays, and worships in the midst of plants, there's tremendous health and well-being benefits. 4 articles worth. So on my website, I talk about what garden centers can do. I got it in red font on my website, and I talk about the benefits and what it is that garden centers could focus on in terms of their marketing right now, because we should not be cutting back. That's another thing that I should emphasize. We should not be cutting back on marketing expenses, which are usually the number one thing that people cut back on when there's a downturn. Exactly. They don't market as enough. However, we should ramp up the marketing, because when everybody else is silent and you've got a megaphone in your hand, you can finally be heard. And we're starting to see, I had an interview at the Wall Street Journal, had a person from the New York Times give me a call, and the Plains Dealer from the Midwest newspaper. There are a lot of people been asking me about gardening, the benefits of landscaping. And so I've had several national interviews with people. And so there's the time is right for emphasizing those kinds of things. Now, I didn't mean to get us off on that too much, but when I'm thinking about the strategies that garden centers need to be employing right now, that's certainly one of them. Yeah. Because had we been doing all of those things I talked about, starting 5 years ago and working up to it, I think we'd find ourselves in a little better shape economically, financially, as garden center businesses than where we're finding ourselves today. Mm-hmm. So that's I don't mean to rub salt in anybody's wounds, but it's so for some of these things it's too little, too late. You're going to have to position yourself better for the next downturn. But you never waste a good crisis, right? And there's some teachable moments here and some defining moments. If we can capture those and implement that into the future, we will make our garden center businesses much more successful that way. I'm doing a lot of talking. What other questions have you got on your mind?
I agree with you. And I think that, I mean, we've touted that there's the benefits of, the green industry, through Facebook and, gardening is therapy. But I mean, we really, like, it's taking it from that fluffy idea of it and making
Right.
it real and making it like showing the benefits and if you have to back that up with stats, then back it up with stats, that whole biophilic idea. And I think that you're right. There was a lot of, one of the other interviews I had with Jim Monroe, he was saying, had we just taken 10% of some of the investment that we did instead of trying to make our garden centers look pretty and to put that into our marketing, that would have
Right.
been, when this came along, we would have been able to go, all right, it's inconvenient, but we're ready for this, and we're able to do this through our marketing and our e-com and everything was set up. So now this is where we're at. We're having to, I'm watching the IGC struggle because not only is it spring and it's already like, the event for us is spring.
Right.
And we've
Right.
got this 10-week of crazy happening right now. We've got trucks coming in and it's just overwhelming already every year. And then this, and then trying to get a website, and you can just see they're drowning. So, one of the things that there's been so much discussion about the e-com and everybody's moving in that direction. But one of the things that when we were discussing what we were about today was you were pointing out how important it is for us in the supply chain and to do our part with supporting vendors. And I think that's really important because
Hmm.
like the growers, they've had to shut down what they're doing. They don't even know if they should be doing another crop that would be coming out in another month, or everything is just stopped for a lot of people and the orders aren't coming in. I'd like you to speak a little bit about how important that is right now and what we can do about that.
Yeah, because there is a phenomena that's happened in previous downturns where not only the things that I've been talking about, but um, all of a sudden, those in the industry that pay their bills on time and so forth, all of a sudden they become slow to pay, and they extend terms well past terms, payment past terms. And I'm not saying that you need to pay every invoice right when it comes in. But you should utilize whatever terms you've negotiated with that supplier or that vendor. However, it's very important to pay those vendors because that has ripples down the supply chain. And for far too many years, we've used our vendors as an industry, and you can look at each stage. We've used our vendors as our bank, and your supplier is not your bank. Your bank is your bank, right? And that's why that banking relationship is so critical. And we are certainly seeing that right now because many of those that do not have their uh, payroll protection program loans in place and already money in the bank, they didn't have necessarily the working relationship that they should have had with the bank. And they had to go back and forth several times, and it took longer to get those applications approved. And here they sit with no money because it ran out. So there's a lesson there. However, this there's that tendency to stretch the terms, and that puts financial pressure on your suppliers, and it goes back and back upstream into the supply chain to where it eventually comes down to the allied trade folks, and then all of a sudden they find themselves into a financial bind, and then we wonder why there's been so much consolidation occur at that sector. It's because they've had not only supply inputs for the green industry growers and landscapers and so forth and the garden centers, but they've had to be the bank. And that's not fair to any business to have to do your business and then also be the banker for your customers.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm encouraging everybody these days, and on a couple of webinars I've done recently, make sure you pay your suppliers on time
Yeah.
and don't use them as the bank. Your bank is your bank. Use them for that purpose.
Mm-hmm. And especially too, I mean, if they're not getting paid, they can't produce more, and your business can't get that product into your store, you can't sell it. And
Yeah.
it's a trickle down effect. You can't, yeah, exactly. If you don't have the product available. I mean, this is a little bit slightly off, but even with that whole cannabis growing industry, we were actually fearing that a lot of greenhouses may switch to doing that instead of just growing 4-inch geranium. And there was that concern. There was a few of them, even in my area, that just kind of stopped growing floral, and they just went and switched that way. Of course, that blew up. There's more than enough supply there, so now they're seeing
Right,
it
right.
back. But that was a big concern, is that if you can't have that product in your store when your customers are coming to look for it, they'll shop elsewhere, or it just be, you can't make those sales. So I agree with you about that whole thing, about that whole keeping your vendors supply so that they can keep going to keep you going.
Right.
Partnership.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. Well, this has been really helpful. I think that you have so much wisdom about everything that you're saying with the whole economic turn. And I know that it's hard to predict right now what's going to happen in the next few months. And of course, we're going through our biggest swing of the season. And when this does finally get to a point, hopefully, that in the next month or two, that things are completely open and back up and rolling again, we're going to be in the heat of summer for most of America. And that's not when our sales are.
I know. Yeah. And you know what? The industry and the way we function is forever changed. I don't know exactly every type of nuance in which we'll be doing things differently, but I see enough happening right now that, I mean, who would have ever thought that spring trials would be, postponed or changed basically and moved online for some of those vendors? Because we put out a lot of new plant varieties, and a lot of those were showcased through spring trials, and breeders had to do a different tactic in order to showcase their wares this year. And of course, we got news yesterday that the Cultivate conference is going to be virtual, right?
Yeah.
That is certainly going to be a new phenomena. And who knows, there may be elements of Cultivate that remain virtual from here on out,
Exactly.
because we're getting very adept at this sort of thing,
Mm-hmm.
right? Now, myself, I got the fancy microphone. I've been doing this for a while, right? So it's not that big of a change for me, because I've been disseminating information this way for a long time. However, we've some folks just 3 months ago couldn't even spell Zoom. They're getting to be Zoom experts, right? So that's the whole nature of the ball game.
Yeah.
And certainly from a communicator's standpoint, that's going to change, I think, the way that we communicate throughout the industry, and not just the garden writers, but through the whole supply chain. There'll be more of this that'll happen because it's less expensive, there's less risk, and I think in some cases you can communicate as effectively. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, if we were sitting in the same room right now, there'd be we would enjoy it perhaps more. But I know if people were videotaping us talking and we were in the same room, it wouldn't be any different,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I think there'll be things like that that will change, and certainly e-commerce applications. If you look at the B2B e-commerce investments that people will make, I think we'll see a ramping up there, and I think we'll certainly see a B2C e-commerce ramping up. And the stop gaps that garden centers and other businesses have made right now in terms of the communications efforts and selling online and so forth, some of those stop gaps are good temporarily, but we're going to have to figure out long-term strategies. How do you do curbside and delivery and all this, some of the things we're stop gapping with now? What do those look like in a permanent situation? Because there are going to be some customers that like, hey, I like calling in and then just showing up at a certain time and picking out my plants. And or I liked having the garden center folks pick out my plants for me, and all I got to do is show up and then have them load them up, or have them delivered to the side yard, and I can just take them from 10 feet here to there. And I got, so yeah, we're going to be a lot of changes,
Mm-hmm.
and don't know exactly what those all encompass right now, but it's going to be certainly be exciting to be a part of that, and to advise people during that process.
It's going to be a really, it forced people to really use this technology And, you know,
Yeah.
we, as garden centers, we've always just kind of relied, spring shows up, all the people come, we make our sales.
Yeah.
Who cares about a website what, you know, they might have a kind of a, you know, a poor little bit of a page, but realizing now how people like to shop. And there's some concern that, well, if we get everything up online, that we would lose customers if we had a shopping, they wouldn't come in anymore. I kind of disagree with that. I think that that gives people the both options. I do shop online, but I like to shop in store too. I'm that
Too.
same, I'm the
Yeah.
same customer, and I can buy the same products either online or in the store. It just depends on, you know, how I want to shop for that product at that time. But what you will gain from it is that you open yourself up, especially with e-com, to not just your local customer. You can get that customer that's in the next city that doesn't want to drive over 45 minutes.
Yeah.
You've opened yourself up. You actually grew your reach. So it's not a bad thing. And the other thing that you were saying too about with the Cultivate, I think that's fabulous. I was actually just thinking about that because we have a show here called Can West. And I'm not sure what's happening with that one either. And I would love to see that they kind of move that direction, because again, people aren't limited. There's folks that just simply can't go to these shows. They have businesses to run, the expense, they can't get away. Being able to be a part of that actually exposes those vendors even more, and not have the booth expense and the travel in between. So I think it's kind of going to be a really cool thing that we're going to see. It's going to completely change every industry, but certainly ours for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
Awesome. Charlie, thank you so much. This is so enlightening. I really appreciate you spending your time with me today. And I really appreciate this, and hope to see you in the real life again really soon.
Yep. Same here. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.